My name is Dr. Chris Jenkins, and I am the CEO of the Orianne Society and the host of the Snake Talk podcast, the podcast where you learn about nature's most feared, maligned, and persecuted animals. I invite you to listen to this conversation, and maybe you'll find that what you perceive as fear is actually rooted in a deep fascination. Welcome to the Snake Talk podcast. I am sitting here with Dr. James Emerson and about ready to have what to me is a pretty exciting conversation. I have over the years now spent a lot of time traveling to the state of Texas and in particular to the Trans-Pecos region of the state, looking at snakes, just this kind of somewhat unique and amazing diversity of snakes that can be found there. And I recently found this paper on arguably one of the most amazing snakes there, the Gray-banded Kingsnake. And this is a snake that, while it's very popular in kind of the captive husbandry circles and field herping circles, there's been very, very little research done on it. And so I found this publication that looked at their ecology, and through that paper I tracked down James, and I'm excited to talk about that and many other things Trans-Pecos today. So welcome to the podcast, James. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for the invite. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, good. Well, I'd like to start off. I know you've listened to some of our episodes, so you probably see this coming. But I'd like to start off with, diving into the background of our guests and figuring out how they got to where they're sitting today. And I always like to start with the fact that, us people who are into snakes, while it seems very normal, it's actually outside the box for most people in the world. And so I like to hear the story of how people came to snakes. So how did it happen for you? Is this something happened when you were young or something more recently? But how'd you get into snakes?
Yeah, so it's one of those things where I've always been drawn to it as a kid. My earliest memory is actually one that might be kind of traumatic by some accounts, but I spent a lot of time with my grandparents as a child, and my granddad was out working in the backyard and came across a garter snake. And of course, he had no idea anything about snakes, what was harmless, what was venomous and stuff like that. So he just chopped it in half with the shovel, and it was still moving, and that terrified him. And so he turned around to run inside, and unbeknownst to him, 6-year-old me was standing right behind him, and he just plowed me over and left me out there with the snake as my grandma was looking on in terror from the kitchen window. But ever since then, it was time in Boy Scouts or whatever, I would go out and find ringneck snakes and stuff like that. I didn't know much about them from a scientific viewpoint, but I was always interested in them. If I had a school project, it was always snakes or sharks. Those were my two things as a kid. So,
gotcha. And so, what region of the country did you grow up in? Where did this infamous garter snake encounter occur?
So I grew up just outside of Amarillo, Texas, in the Texas Panhandle. So far north Texas, very different from southern and west Texas.
Gotcha. Do you know what? I don't know my garter snake geography that well. Do you know which species of garter snake that was? Now that you're older and have studied them?
I'm not certain, but almost certainly it was a checkered garter snake, Marcianus. Just because that's the most common snake that we see, in developed areas up there. Mm-hmm.
Great. So you grew up in kind of North Texas, and you've got this fascination with snakes, and you've managed to run that gauntlet of being taught that snakes are a bad thing. I'm assuming, by the way, your grandfather responded to that garter snake. So you have this fascination, and what, as you're moving on and kind of going through high school, when did you realize, like, oh, this is something that I could potentially do, or could be part of my career someday, was working with these animals? How did that come about?
Yeah. So, and I will say that once they really found out how interested I was in snakes, they kind of switched directions from saying that snakes are a bad thing. Even though they were scared of snakes, they were really good at supporting my interests and helping nurture like my quest for knowledge and stuff like that. But
That's great.
In terms of a career, I was pretty late to the game. Like, I had no idea that I could pursue this as a career until probably my late 20s. And so I actually graduated high school and went to local community college. I tried to do more practical, things degree wise, pre-pharmacy, pre-physical therapy, but my heart wasn't into it. So my grades would suffer as a result of that. And ultimately, I ended up taking a year and a half or 2 years off from school, at which point I was an assistant manager for Subway. And as worst job I ever had in my life. But I was in there one day, and a guy that I became friends with in one of those intro chemistry courses, like, he stopped in, and I asked him what he was doing, and he was graduating with his master's in wildlife biology from the local four-year university there. And so then I was like fed up with the Subway job at that point. So I was like, oh, what does that entail? Is there anybody there that works with reptiles? I've always been interested in reptiles. And he was like, I did bird work, but my master's advisor's primary areas of research are herpetology. And so at that point was kind of when I found out that West Texas A&M University had a wildlife biology degree program and a master's program. And so, that kind of conversation at Subway kind of completely altered the path that I was on. And I was like, oh, I can do this as a profession. And then when I went back to school to West Texas A&M, of course, I had no issues with grades and stuff like that because I was really into all my classes, and like it was fun because it was what I wanted to do. So, and at no point in my undergrad did I think I would pursue a master's, and at no point in my master's did I think I'd pursue a PhD, as kind of just chasing opportunities as they popped up along the way. And here I am.
Yeah. So you ended up getting an undergraduate degree in wildlife biology then, but, being able to interface with this herpetologist. Then you went on to get a master's. Did you stay at West Texas A&M, or did you move on to another institution?
I did. And my master's was like up and down. So I didn't formally finish it for kind of reasons that we probably don't want to talk about publicly here. But I did like 99.9% of the process. And so I got that was my first dedicated research experience. And then I went to, I found the PhD opportunity at UTEP. So I moved out there. And
how, for your master's, we don't need to get into some of the details, but just in terms of the research, what were you focusing on for your research at that time?
Yeah, so in the northeastern Texas Panhandle, there's a unique riparian ecosystem where like high plains and rolling plains meet, and I was looking at the influence of broad-scale habitat types on snake community characteristics. And so broadly, I was looking at how upland sand-sage snake communities, upland sand-sage prairie, snake communities differ from lowland wet meadow communities. But 2010 through 2013 in that part of the world were like historically dry conditions. And so like one of those years is the driest year on record in the Texas Panhandle, and another one's like the third driest year on record. And so wet meadows were not wet, to say the least. And so it kind of messed up a little bit of my line of questioning and inquiry there. But we still saw some cool stuff, and I learned a lot about science and how to conduct research. And that's where I really learned that, you know, being out in the field answering kind of original research questions was ultimately where I wanted to be. And so that dictated my pursuit of a PhD.
Gotcha. So with the PhD, you mentioned you went to UTEP, which is University of Texas, El Paso. And for people who haven't been there, I mean, it's in the extreme western corner, if you will, of Texas, and just in a really fascinating place ecologically. It's in that Trans-Pecos region that I mentioned in the beginning. So when you went there to do the PhD, again, we're going to talk about some of the focus of your dissertation later in the episode, so I don't want to go into detail, but did you end up going there for an existing project, or did you end up going there to work in a lab and had the ability to develop your own project?
Yeah, so I had a lot of freedom in development of my project and how I wanted to tackle that. I basically went there because when I went on my visitation, they took me out to their research station, which for those of your listeners that aren't familiar with it, they have the Indio Mountains Research Station, in which UTEP basically owns a mountain range in West Texas. And so spent the weekend out at the research station, and I was like, I don't know what I want to do out here, but I definitely want to be out here. So that the access to the research station was basically what swung it for me.
Gotcha. And again, we'll talk about it later in the episode, but you ended up working with rattlesnakes for your dissertation research. Was there something to that? Was it, do you have a kind of a primary interest in venomous snakes or rattlesnakes, or is it snakes in general, and that just happened to be a species that was abundant enough, or there was a need, that type of thing?
Yeah, so over the course of working in the Texas Panhandle, I really fell in love with Massasaugas, and my interest in Massasaugas kind of ballooned into this broad rattlesnake interest as well. And so at that time, I was also kind of branching out of my local areas and exploring herps more and seeing some of the incredible like desert mountain rattlesnake diversity that there is in the southwestern U.S. I knew I wanted to work with a montane species in, desert mountains.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, we'll talk about that in more detail, but today you're sitting at Texas State University, correct? So how did you end up, you finished the PhD, did you go right to Texas State, or was there anything in between?
Yeah, so I defended my PhD in April of 2020. If you remember what was going on back then, that was beginning of COVID pandemic. Right after that, a lot of PhD students from UT El Paso, we transitioned into the El Paso Community College adjunct teaching roles. Mm-hmm. And I did that. I really loved El Paso. I never wanted to leave, but being a border town, a lot of El Paso Community College enrollment is international. So a lot of students from Juarez come up to attend college. And with international travel ban during COVID, their enrollment dropped precipitously. So I would have the position there, and we'd get to the beginning of the semester and my classes wouldn't make or whatever. And so I would be stuck trying to live without a paycheck. And so ultimately I decided to move back to Amarillo, kind of live with family for a little bit and see if I could find a more full-time permanent position elsewhere. And that's where this, I saw the job at Texas State University pop up. So August of 22 was my first semester at Texas State University. And I got hired on there to be the undergraduate wildlife biology program director. And it's primarily a teaching role. So I teach a lot of classes there. So like this semester, I'm teaching mammalogy, herpetology, and wildlife management. But yeah, so far I really enjoy it. I like this part of the world. I enjoy the other faculty that I work with. So it's been good for the past couple of years.
Good. Great. Well, let's transition and start talking about the snake communities down in this region. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, from my perspective, the Trans-Pecos region is one of the most amazing places in North America for snake communities, diversity, kind of unique species, those types of things. And so maybe to kind of kick the discussion off about, these research projects we're working on, tell us, when I say the Trans-Pecos, like, what is the Trans-Pecos region? What does it kind of encompass? What is the landscape like, the habitat generally like, climate generally like? Just kind of, paint that background to the picture before we get into the snakes, if you would.
Yeah, so generally the Trans-Pecos ecoregion of Texas is treated as Texas west of the Pecos River. And so kind of that western arm of Texas, for those of you who aren't super familiar with where the Pecos River and stuff like that is, basically that western arm of Texas that hops over, underneath New Mexico and stuff like that. It's northern Chihuahuan Desert. And so there is a mix of kind of your more typical low sandy desert, but it's also the only region in Texas that has mountain ranges. And so there's also a bunch of these mountain ranges that pop up, and they basically function as like sky islands to influence distributions and those kinds of things of herpetofaunal and mammalian communities as well. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting landscape. It's beautiful. It reminds me, I lived in the West for a long time and still work and recreate there. It's one of these landscapes where you drive around and you look at it and you think of it like, in a sense, like somewhere like in Montana where you see all these giant mountains. But the big difference is that the majority of the mountain ranges and the land in general in that region are private. So it's not accessible, which in some ways for the snake communities is probably a good thing. In other ways, it's not. But that's also the reason, I don't mind talking about this region in a little more detail than I might others, because most of it's not accessible to people who would go collect or, do kind of, field herping and in a maybe an unethical way that might influence the animals. So the other thing I'd mention about it is that it's different than most of the country in terms of its climate. It's more of like a monsoonal climate. Maybe describe that a little bit, because it's really important in terms of snake communities and their ecology. Snakes are one of the most persecuted groups of animals in the world, but we are dedicated to changing that. If you like what we've been discussing here on the Snake Talk podcast, here's an opportunity to turn that inspiration into action. Head over to www.orian.org and explore how you can support the Orian Society. Click on Take Action on our menu to make a difference.
Yeah, so that is a good point, Chris, because a lot of people are not familiar with that monsoonal climate. I actually had this pop up in some of the reviews for the research that we'll talk about coming up later as I was submitting papers and stuff like that. But it is very unique in that it is low precipitation, as would be suggested by desert, but 90 to 95% of that precipitation comes in a 1 month to 6 week window that begins anywhere from late July to early August and runs anywhere from late August to early to mid-September, depending on the year. And so most of the time, the majority of your precipitation is going to fall in these windows. A lot of areas, especially the mountainous areas, do get a kind of initial rainstorm in late May, early June, sometime around there. And then we get a little bit of snow precipitation in the winter, but not a whole lot.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about not getting the details yet of the species we're going to talk about, but we've kind of painted that background to the painting, if you will. But let's talk about the snake communities. I already talked about them being, in my mind, really incredible from a diversity perspective, from a kind of being somewhat unique. I guess I should say unique to the United States, but it's just a very interesting snake community. So maybe just talk about, some of the species that are there that, kind of define how special this, this snake community in the region is.
Yeah. So a lot of snake diversity out there. Of course, first and foremost in the minds of herpers, like you mentioned previously, is going to be the gray-banded kingsnake, Lampropeltis alterna, occurring in many of the mountain ranges out there. Another one that a lot of herp folks like to target, especially those interested in rattlesnakes, are going to be rock rattlesnakes. Rock rattlesnakes are really unique because there is a lot of phenotypic variability within that species. And so you go to different mountain ranges or even different canyons within a mountain range, and you get vastly different looking individuals of the same species. And kind of the more upper elevations to mid elevations are going to be eastern or ornate black-tailed rattlesnakes, so Rhodolus ornatus. Those are always cool one to see for people because black-tailed rattlesnakes tend to have pretty good demeanors, and they're gorgeous to look at, and they're found in spectacular scenery. Other non-venomous species that herpers love to see out there are things like Trans-Pecos rat snakes. Bogertophus subocularis is kind of everybody's favorite gentle kind of big snake out there with their kind of bug eyes, and they, in my experience at least, with the ones I've handled, they're very reluctant to bite or anything of put up any real measured defensive behavior. Then you get into like the lowland deserts out there, and people like to chase around like the hognose snakes. We have Mexican hognose snakes out there in kind of the flat, sandy desert areas. Let's see, you go to specific areas, not where I worked at UTEP's research station, but you get things like the Big Bend black-headed snake, so the big Tantilla cuculata, which is like the 2+ foot long Tantilla, which most of the black-headed snakes are small and relatively nondescript. Also, you get into those sandy grassland areas where you find hognose snakes. You can find hook-nosed snakes as well, and those are interesting ones. They do the cloacal popping defenses, so a lot of herpers like to see those for their, farting snakes, telling them to leave them alone and stuff like that. Also in those grasslands, you get Mojave rattlesnakes, prairie rattlesnakes. You get into more of the creosote flat stuff. You get a lot of western diamondback rattlesnakes. So probably the most commonly encountered snake in West Texas is going to be the western diamondback rattlesnake. Sonoran gopher snakes are kind of a charismatic, large, non-venomous snake that people love to find. And then you go to some other more specialized areas and you get, the Trans-Pecos copperheads, which in my opinion are the most attractive of the copperhead forms or species or subspecies, whatever you want to call
it. I would agree with that.
And then some other places you get things like Baird's rat snakes and stuff like that, which are also real fun targets for herpers.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I think that just reinforces it's really an amazing place from snake community perspective. So let's talk a little bit about what I would kind of argue is like the crown jewel of that region for people who travel there for snakes, the gray-banded kingsnakes. People sometimes call them alterna or gray bands. There's, and you'll probably hear me use all of these in this conversation, but
me too.
I mean, this is probably one of the most targeted, not necessarily the most commonly found, but one of the most targeted snake species for field herpers in the U.S. And they're also relatively, I would say, common in kind of the husbandry and captive breeding setting where people are breeding them and trying to come up with these interesting color morphs. And I think a lot of that has to do with just how visually stunning these animals are, and they can vary quite a bit in how they look. So maybe just kind of give that what do gray-banded kingsnakes look like, and how does that vary?
Yeah, so there's two main kind of wild types of gray-banded kingsnakes. I believe, if my memory serves correct, a long time ago, they actually used to be listed as subspecies, but they've since been sunk to ecomorphs because there's really not a lot of rhyme or reason as to why they occur, that we can figure out at least. And so broadly, you have the alterna phase, which tends to have really wide gray bands and varying number of small kind of pinstripe, either black bands or black with a little bit of red or orange in their bands. And those tend to be kind of flanked by white to create kind of this contrasty, broad, gray banded snake with these thin black or black and orange pinstripes. Then we have the alterna phase, which has those broad gray bands, but instead of kind of the thin black to brown to orange speckled pinstripes, it has these broad orange to bright red, almost saddles across the back. And those are also tend to be flanked in white. So it creates this really striking contrasty pattern. Most of the Blair's phase, the ones that have the orange saddles, they tend to occur in the eastern part of the range, so kind of eastern Trans-Pecos. But especially kind of in the middle of the range within Texas, you can go to a mountain range and find alterna phase and Blair's phase right next to each other. But out west, where I did most of my work, we have alterna phases. And so we're dealing with the broad gray bands with the pinstripes, the small kind of black with a little bit of orange maybe scattered throughout looking things. But they are, I totally agree with you that they are kind of the visual crown jewels of certainly West Texas herpetofauna, if not, U.S. herpetofauna. And so people love chasing things around.
Yeah, I've taken to calling animals like that the flashy colubrids. Those other mountain king snakes in the West, and maybe some of the large snakes like indigo snakes and other things. But
some of the milk snakes.
Yeah, there you go. So with the gray-banded kingsnake, so you're in El Paso and you're working at this research station, and we'll talk about the rattlesnakes in a little while. But the main reason I wanted to talk to you, or at least get keyed into you initially, is because there's very little known about the ecology of this snake in the wild. And you were able, sample sizes were small, but you were able to gather just some initial kind of descriptive information. Mm-hmm. And I guess before we get into what you studied and what you found, like, what prompted this? You were in that region working on other things. What made you decide that you wanted to study these gray bands?
Yeah, and so kind of my journey through gray-banded kingsnakes is kind of up and down as well. And so when I moved to El Paso, I had never seen a gray-banded kingsnake. I had looked at for them in some of the eastern parts of the range a couple of times, but no luck. And so I became dead set on finding them at the UTEP research station for my lifer snake, just because that snake or that range has been a dedicated research station since the early 90s. Most of the research that's gone on there has been herpetological in nature. And prior to my arrival, they had only caught 2 gray-banded kingsnakes there. And both of them were way back in 1997. And so I was like, I'm going to have to walk all over this mountain range regardless for my rattlesnake data. And so while I'm out there, I might as well put in the time and effort to try to start figuring out what alterna are doing out here. And we got to a point. I was working with another PhD student at the time. You actually may be aware of him because he works in Georgia now, but is Dr. Dominic DeSantis. He was working on Western Diamondback stuff while I was working on my blacktail stuff. And he was like, let's go ahead and buy some extra small transmitters. So if we catch rock rattlesnakes, we can put a few transmitters in rock rattlesnakes. That way we have telemetry data on all 3 rattlesnake species concurrently. So there had been previous telemetry research done on rock rattlesnakes, but not concurrent with what we were doing. So we put a couple of transmitters in rock rattlesnakes. They were beginning to stage for egress, and both of our rock rattlesnakes got picked off by what seemed to be badgers before we could get any meaningful data on them. And then we happened to find this big, beautiful adult female alterna, and the light bulb kind of just went off like, hey, we have these transmitters. Our rock rattlesnakes are getting killed. Let's get alterna put on our permits and put this transmitter in her and see what she does. And maybe we'll catch more in the next couple of years. And so that's kind of how it started. And it was really fun to track these things.
Yeah. So that was, I'm assuming that female was also your first alterna.
Yes. No, that was actually my second one.
Oh, was it? Okay.
Yeah.
And so you end up putting radio transmitters, and we don't need to go through what that is. I mean, I think the audience, we've had a number of episodes, but basically radio technology that allows you to follow animals. So you put these transmitters into 2 snakes, which again is low sample size, but for this species is still completely kind of groundbreaking, exploratory type work. And it was a male and a female, correct?
Correct.
And were they in the same general area or different areas of the mountain range? How did that lay out?
They were pretty far apart. And so they were in different canyons for sure. But the female was kind of along one of the main roads in the property. And then prior to the property being acquired or donated to UTEP as a research station, it was a functioning ranch. And as part of that, there was a lot of exploratory mining that went on in the mid to early 1900s out there. And so the male, I actually found, I was tracking some of my black-tailed rattlesnakes in this area. These man-made mine tails create these big rock slides where kind of at the top of the rock slides, you get this small gravelly substrate, and then the bigger stuff goes to the bottom. And my black-tailed rattlesnakes would hang out in the bigger rocks at the bottom. And I was tracking one of them one night, and right before sundown, and happened to just decide to walk up through this mine tail, see if anything else was moving just, beneath the surface. And I caught this glimpse of like one shiny black and gray band, like right between 2 rocks. And it was just like instant, like, oh, alterna. So just grab it. And then I had to be pretty delicate teasing it out of there so it didn't get crushed by any rocks or anything like that. I didn't want to create an avalanche on it. But yeah, so they are different areas of the property, and they were only alternas numbers 4 and 5 that had ever been documented within that mountain range. And so when we started with the female, we were just like, if we can get transmitters out in alterna at this place, and this is only the 4th individual that's been seen here, people who are doing work in those areas where they might be like a little bit more abundant, like if we put this out there, they will see like it can be done, and they are suitable for radio telemetry research. And so that was kind of our goal with it. We knew we wouldn't have like robust sample sizes within the Indio Mountains at any point, but just proving it could be done was important to us.
Yeah. And what was your approximate battery life on the transmitters you're using?
Yeah. So we're using transmitters that are rated at 9 to 12 months, but they had the temperature sensors in them. So normally, in my experience, the ones that have the temperature sensors, you probably want to pull, around 8 months or whatever, because hot environments like that their batteries. They're going to beat faster because they're hotter, so the battery's going to wear out sooner.
Yeah. Okay, so you have these two snakes online that people really know very little about in the wild. Talk to us about kind of what you learned about these snakes and how they move through these landscapes, how they use these landscapes.
Yeah, so like that was probably the coolest part about this project, because every time those snakes did anything, we were witnessing basically something that had never been documented before. And so it was always super exciting, like those 2 days a week that we'd go to the research station and figure out what they were doing. And so we were surprised at, especially with the female, just how much space they used. And so for being secretive snakes, they don't come out a lot. Their movement frequencies were pretty low, but when they were out, they were maximizing whatever they were doing, because they were just going. And so for a relatively small snake, let me double check it. I don't want to say the wrong thing real quickly. But yeah, our female had both our female and our male alternas had larger home range sizes than any of the rattlesnakes that we had looked at on the property. And so if you look at, 100% MCPs factoring in all of that, all of those points.
And so they wouldn't move much, but when they did, they would really move.
Right. It would be like, 400 meter movements, 800 meter movements. I think we had one with the male that was like a 1400 meter movement just in a span of like a couple of days. So they wouldn't be out much, but when those environmental triggers hit and conditions were right, they were going. Mm-hmm. And on the instances that we saw them out and moving, like, I don't know if have you kept alterna in captivity?
I have not.
Okay. But in captivity, they're kind of these goofy things that try to like pin pinkies. And it's like, you look at them and you're like, how do these things survive out there with all these things trying to eat them and stuff like that? But when we saw them like in situ out there, they were moving almost like you would see like a racer move during the day. It was just like grass clump to grass clump, like every burrow they came across, every rock they came across, they were scent probing in the burrow under the rock. If nothing was there, on to the next, and just like covering ground. And then morning would come and they would pick like these dime-sized like little holes in the gravelly substrate and just go down there and ride it out until they came out again and do it all over.
And were they kind of like nomadic in a sense, and that they were just kind of moving around these landscapes, or were there like central places and points that you noticed they were kind of centralized around, coming back to, or was it just kind of roaming these landscapes looking for food, mates, whatever it might be?
Yeah, so they definitely had defined home range boundaries. So they would get to a certain point and they would turn around and go back to where they came from. And so like the male, for example, even when he moved on like those 1400 meter movements, in a couple of days, he'd be back at that same mine tail where I found him. And so that mine tail was like his home base. That's where he overwintered, and he would always come back to that one spot.
Okay. Interesting. And you mentioned conditions. So obviously nocturnal movement primarily. what were conditions that were right for movement? Was it temperature? Was it humidity? When were these snakes moving at, anything you could predict, or it was kind of just moving at night?
So really the only predictor was moisture. So both of our snakes would not egress until those first rains hit in early to late May. And so they would have a really late egress compared to other snakes that we've dealt with out there. Like I had some of my black-tailed rattlesnakes that were out in like February. But they would wait until that first rain event to the warm season before they came out.
But they were active beyond the monsoon season, or were they most active during the monsoon? How did that play out?
Yeah, so one of the things we were hoping for is we were really hoping, since we had that female, we were like, yeah, this is going to be great. We'll at least get one or two males that are coming to her in like June, because that's how it works with rattlesnakes, right? You catch a female, all of a sudden you catch 10s, 20s males coming to check out that female. But we didn't see, even though they would move, we didn't have any visual encounters during that period. So we think the majority of their movements were in like these subsurface networks of tunnels within like rock slides and fissured crevices and stuff like that. And that's just speculation on our part because we didn't witness it, but we would try to increase our presence out there in order to maximize encounters when this was going on. Mm-hmm. But it just didn't really work. Most of the actual surface activity encounters that we saw were monsoon season. And interestingly enough, like one of the coolest things that I saw in my time at the Indio Mountains Research Station was there was one instance where it had rained at like 11 a.m. in the morning. And I went out to get all of my radio telemetry locations for my rattlesnakes. And I was at that mine shaft area. So I was like, let's just check and see what's happening with alterna, even though it's like, I think it was like around 4 p.m. in the afternoon. Ground temperatures were like 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity was just really high because of that early morning rain event. And I went to track him, and he was out foraging middle of the day, 100-degree ground temperatures, and he was exhibiting like that same behavior, just super quick. We'll find a clump of lechuguilla, see if there's a lizard in there. If not, move on to the next. And I followed him for like almost an hour doing that. But then at a certain point, like the clouds broke and the sun came out, so he coiled up under a lechuguilla, and he was under the same lechuguilla the following morning. But it was really cool to see him out like during the day, just like cruising through these like desert hills trying to chase down lizards.
Whether you're passionate about preserving biodiversity, ensuring the survival of threatened species, or simply want to contribute to a healthier planet, there's a role for you. Your support isn't just a contribution, it's an investment in a future where our ecosystems thrive. Go to www.orian.org to donate or become a member today. So you mentioned that they had these kind of like central places that you'd find them a lot, that they would do these excursions from, that they would come back to. It sounds like kind of rocky areas. I know you in the paper I read, you characterized kind of the habitats that you found them in, and I'd be curious for you to describe that, and then also describe, like when you were getting the locations, because for example, if all your locations were taken during the day, I know you just said you saw one out during the day, but on average, they're going to be kind of hunkered down during the day. Mm-hmm. And so, were you out there getting these at night when they were moving? Were you out there getting them during the day when they're hunkered down? And what types of habitats were you finding them using?
Yeah. So quickly, I will just mention our scheduling around getting the locations first, and then I'll describe the habitats. And so we knew that in order to have observations of unique behaviors, we were going to have to kind of deviate from our traditional, rattlesnake schedule of collecting data. And so we would make it a point, since we had 2 snakes, and at the time there were 2 of us kind of on this project working together. And so Dr. DeSantis had a couple of his Western Diamondbacks that were closer to the female, and I had a couple of my black-tailed rattlesnakes that were closer to the male. And so for a lot of the time, he would track the female, I would track the male. And we would do 2 relocations per day. And so we would do per day that we were there. So we would be there 2 days a week. And so on each of those days, we would do 2 relocations on the alterna. The first one would just be our standard data collection location to get that point data to put into R to calculate home ranges and stuff like that. And so that would happen at some point during the day, so usually inactive period. Then after we got all of our rattlesnake locations, we would kind of sometimes it would already be getting dark depending on how many snakes we had out. Sometimes we'd have to wait a couple of hours until dusk, but we would go back out and track them nocturnally as well to see if we could catch them moving or doing, anything exciting. And that's where we were able to see like those foraging behaviors and stuff like that. And then sorry, did you have a follow-up?
Oh, no, I was just going to ask you about the habitat.
Yeah. And so for the habitats at Indio Mountains Research Station, if I refer to IMRS, that's what I'm referring to as well. So for the listeners, if I say IMRS, I'm talking about Indio Mountains Research Station. So at IMRS, we defined 5 broad habitat types that are present throughout the property. Rocky slopes are going to be those areas typically towards the mountain tops, but this is going to be where emergent bedrock is the substrate. So you have just this networks of like rim rock and fissures and stuff like that. Alluvial rocky slopes are a little bit lower on the slopes than rocky slopes. Usually you can also get some on the very tops of the mountains where you get those like grassy hilltops as well. But this has, less than 50% emergent bedrock coming out of the substrate, and it's surrounded by, gravel-sized alluvium around, but it's still in those areas where the emergent bedrock comes up, it still has those fissures and crevices and stuff like that for things to hide in. Then alluvial slopes are just those gravel slopes that don't have that emergent fissured bedrock. And so most of them at IMRS are covered with like desert grass species. So a lot of like black grama grass and stuff like that. So they tend to just also be commonly just referred to as like grassy hilltops. Alluvial flats, these are basically what you would consider a creosote flat. So kind of flat areas and the lower elevations of the mountain. Creosote bush is dominant vegetation. There's not a lot of topographic relief. Pretty much the only hiding places for a snake within an alluvial flat is going to be within succulents, so lechugia or prickly pear clusters, or in rodent burrows. Then lastly, we had arroyos. Arroyos are kind of the drainage veins of the mountains. So the rain that falls on the mountains is funneled into the arroyo. The arroyos are going to transport the water down to the Rio Grande River ultimately. And so these tend to be kind of wide, flat, kind of like small canyons, but because they retain soil moisture on each side of that drainage way, there tends to be thick bands of vegetation. And so, and then coming up from the arroyos, there's usually a lot of emergent bedrock and stuff like that. So arroyos have a lot of fissured crevices and vegetation for cover and stuff like that. And so for our alterna, we found that, let me pull it back up just to be specific. But yeah, so overall, most of our snakes were on those rocky slopes with the emergent bedrock like near the top. So when they did move kind of down in elevation, they would kind of follow ridge lines down. And then we also had a lot in both alluvial rocky slopes and arroyo habitats. And so for all the snakes that we've done telemetry on at IMRS, arroyo habitat seems to be very important for them with that complex heterogeneity of habitat that all comes together right there. And so, but for the alterna specifically, I think like 45%. Yeah, like 45% of our observations were in those rocky slope habitats.
Gotcha. So they're preferring these rocky slopes, these cliff bands almost, but they're moving quite a bit. And it sounds like when they're moving, they're staying in these rocky areas, but they'll also make these movements kind of down, over the slopes into the arroyos and other places as well. So, any other before we leave them, the alterna, any other interesting things, whether just small anecdotes or things you guys analyzed about kind of the ecology of gray-banded kingsnakes in the wild? Anything worth mentioning?
Yes. Well, one of the coolest observations that we had was with the female. And this was when she was overwintering. So fairly typical to snakes in that part of the world. They would, she would choose to go high up to a rock pile to overwinter. Kind of different than a lot of the species. She chose kind of a northwest facing slope. And so she chose like a cooler slope to overwinter, which we assume was related to water conservation. But then in the winter, we got pretty decent snow at IMRS. And when we got, and it like was timed perfectly. So like, I think we were going out on like a Tuesday and a Friday that week, something along those lines. And so we went on a Tuesday, weather was perfectly fine. And then like Thursday night, we got the snow event. And then Friday, it started melting because, it doesn't stay below freezing for long out there. And so We showed up on like Friday morning. She was kind of in her same little spot that she'd been overwintering. But when we left the property in the evening, she had moved like 100 meters down slope. And so we think that she was following like the melting water getting to the bottom of that rock slide so she could get some winter moisture.
Do you think she was on the surface or subterranean?
No, it was one contiguous like big rock pile. So we don't think she had to come out to get there.
Huh. Fascinating. That is really cool.
Like even when we got it, you could tell that she was still kind of moving a little bit back in there, even though it was like really cold outside and stuff. Because for people that aren't familiar with telemetry, even if the snake's obscured, you can still get an idea of what they're doing underneath there. If they're moving, you can hear the signal bounce around and stuff.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, last question about alterna, and I guess first of all, I'll kind of preface it with a statement in that I'm curious what these results, again, very low sample size, but and how it relates to conservation of these animals. And there's a lot of factors that they face, like many species, in terms of in a conservation context. But one thing this animal faces is really intense field herping pressure, which I mentioned. Which I don't know if I'd classify myself as a field herper, but I do like to go out and look for animals. But what was interesting to me is that when you're out field herping for this species, if you find one, you keep it. And most, I think, I don't want to speak for everybody, but I think most people, most field herpers that find one of these in the wild, keep it. I think that's kind of the standard, even if they're not kind of, these aren't people who are collectors and, big breeding snake, but they keep them, and maybe they have a small scale. They have 4 or 5 of them and try to breed them or whatever it might be. So that surprised me just in general. Again, I'm not concerned about the status of the species, given the amount of land that's not accessible. But I am curious. I don't want to go into how people find these, not that it's a big secret. And, I've done it many times, but I'm not going to mention it on the podcast. We can figure it out if they want. But I will say that it's based on particular places. And so if you're going to these particular places to look for these animals, what was interesting to me from your data is that these animals, yes, they move quite a bit, but they also have places where they spend good amounts of time. And I'm just curious if you've put any thought to, or have speculated what the movement patterns you observed, the habitat use patterns you observed, implications relative to field herping and collection. And again, I'm not worried about their populations, but I'm curious, after this conversation, are we essentially lowering numbers in places we look for them, because these are kind of the central places? I mean, anyways, I'm kind of rambling on, but maybe you could speculate on that, what your thoughts are on field herping, habitat use movements, those types of things.
Yeah, so I think that is a potential issue. One of the things that is very different about IMRS versus where most herpers find these things is the kind of distributions of the lizard community, which for all intents and purposes, that's going to be the prey base of these things. And so the areas where herpers target tend to be high density gathering points of crevice spiny lizards. And many herpers do find these things trying to yank crevice spiny lizards out of crevices at night and stuff like that. At IMRS, we have a very tiny pocket of crevice spiny lizards on the property, but most of that over 40,000 acres of mountain range doesn't have crevice spiny lizards. And so I think they're foraging a little bit different at IMRS than they would be in those areas that people are herping, mainly because they're having to eat things like Cophosaurus and Buddha, and so greater earless lizards, side blotch lizards, various whip-tailed lizard species. So I think this takes them a little bit into those alluvial habitats more at IMRS, because that's where a lot of the prey base is going to be at this site. I am curious, like I really want somebody to kind of take a project like this and run with it in one of those more kind of popular herping destinations or like adjacent to it, just to see if I'm right, because like this is basically just a wild guess based on two individuals that I happen to follow. And so I'm really interested to see if their behavior is different at those places, because I suspect within those herped areas, they learn that, and it becomes ingrained that they can rely on this one area for high densities of crevice spiny lizards, and so they go there to eat, and that's when they get snatched by herpers and stuff like that. And so since they do move a lot, these snakes could be living, 2 kilometers off the road, and they just make their way towards the road kind of in their routine, like feeding movement patterns. But yeah, in terms of actual like concrete stuff, I really don't know whether it makes them more or less susceptible to collection. But I think the fact that phenomenon does exist within the species, where even if somebody doesn't have a snake, most of the time they take home their lifer alterna, or they know somebody that keeps alternas and they collect it and pass it off to somebody else, because they took those tips and tricks that the other person gave them to help them find their own. And so I am really interested in kind of people doing more robust research to see if we do have reason for conservation concern with the collection pressures that they have.
Yeah. Great. Well, I kept talking about these ornate black-tailed rattlesnakes that we're going to talk about. We've already been going over an hour, so I think what we should probably do is give a little teaser, and then in the next month or two, you and I should get back on here and do a whole episode on that if you're open to it. But why don't you give the literal like 4 or 5 sentence teaser for the core of your work in this mountain range on the rattlesnakes? What was it that you studied? What was it that was kind of fascinating about it, and why would people want to listen to this second episode we're going to record?
Yeah, so most of my work in the Indio Mountains was focused on Crotalus ornatus, the eastern or ornate black-tailed rattlesnake, depending on who you ask about that common name. And it's an interesting species because for the longest time, it was lumped in with the northern black-tailed rattlesnake, Crotalus molossus. Early on, Wolfgang Wooster did this revision of the neotropical rattlesnake complexes, and he used black-tailed rattlesnakes as one of his outgroups. And if you look at that phylogeny, you can see two different groups of black-tailed rattlesnakes wash out, like an eastern group and a western group. And so that inspired a master's student, also who worked at University of Texas at El Paso, Chris Anderson, to look into this for his master's thesis. And he found that indeed they're not the same species, but not only are they not the same species as that initial phylogeny from Wooster's publication suggested, they're not sister species. So Crotalus molossus is sister with Crotalus basiliscus, the Mexican West Coast rattlesnake, and Crotalus ornatus is sister with Crotalus totonaccus, the Totonacan rattlesnake. And so there needs to be more work on this, especially along the Continental Divide, which is the mixing zone, to see how much they hybridize and behaviorally partition and stuff like that. But that's what inspired me to do this, because once that revalidation of Crotalus ornatus occurred, most of the published research on black-tailed rattlesnakes in the U.S. was on from Arizona populations or far western New Mexico populations. And so that would fall under was now Crotalus molossus, not Crotalus ornatus. I know some researchers long before me have done telemetry stuff on blacktails in Texas, but none of that research, to my knowledge, has been published or presented. And so I wanted to do a thorough study to, get a handle on what's going on with them behaviorally, at least with this population, and try to fill in some of the gaps that revalidation created. So I did a telemetry component where I looked at movement, space use, habitat, and microhabitat selection of them. But then I took some of my gravid females, brought them into captivity so they could give birth. And I also, inspired by a lot of the stuff that Rulon Clark had done before me, I wanted to look at innate prey preference in them. And so I took those kind of naive babies, put them through a set of trials with scent cues from known and suspected prey items and kind of measured their responses to see what they did. So, I'll be happy to talk about that stuff in a lot more detail here in a month or so.
Yeah, great. Well, the teaser is, again, similar to these gray-banded kingsnake studies, that this is, studying an animal that is relatively unknown because it's this new, the ornate or eastern version of a blacktail. So, but we'll talk about that more later. I want to begin wrapping this up, and as I think James, I'd like to have all of my guests tell me a snake story. And so, do you have a good snake story for us today?
I do, and to be consistent with today's theme, you kind of hinted at it earlier, but I actually chose to reserve my lifer alterna story for this part of the podcast. And so the first alterna that I found at Indio Mountains Research Station was not one that we put a transmitter in. And so when I initially met with my advisor there, he was like, so when you're working on IMRS, like, what snakes do you want to see? And I was like, alterna popped out of my mouth immediately. And he was like, yeah, we found 2 of those in 97 and that's it. So you're not going to see those. So try to kind of meter your ambitions a little bit.
Challenge taken.
Yeah. And so we were out one night. This was August of 2015. This was my first intense field season of my PhD research. And we had found a small female black-tailed rattlesnake coiled on the side of the road. And at this time, I only had males with transmitters. So I was like, yeah, I need a female. This is great. But it turned out to be a female that had been radio tracked previously by another researcher at the research station. And we kind of decided, she's already been through the run. We don't want to, do surgery on her again, stress her out even more. She's paid her dues. So I was disappointed, but I was like, okay, we'll go find another one. The night was not going well. We weren't seeing much of interest. I was climbing up this mountain side, and it was an alluvial mountainside, and I saw a little blind snake. Tried to grab it, slipped and fell, rolled down the mountain, like scraped up my elbows and stuff like that. So I got kind of upset and decided that I was just going to pout about it a little bit. And so I just went down to the road, which was close to where we saw that female black-tailed rattlesnake, and was like, I'm just going to walk along the road and see if I see any other rattlesnakes, just because she was just coiled and ambushed, like on the dirt road there. And so I was like, I'm going to see if I can find any useful snakes this way and not fall down any more mountains. I get a couple of miles down the road, and in what nobody would ever associate with being alterna habitat, this was like one of the biggest creosote flats on the property. I just see these bands like coming onto the road, these like shiny gray and black bands. And I was like, no way. So like I sprinted up to it and I grabbed it, which was in my excitement, which was unfortunate because in hindsight, we think that it was scent trailing a roadkill greater earless lizard that was right there. And so, but then I threw it in a bag, and Dr. DeSantis was down in another arroyo trying to find atrox and stuff, like probably a mile away. And so I was like so excited. I was like sprinting down the road to find Dominic like as fast as I could. And he was way back up the arroyo, and he saw my headlamp coming, and he was like, oh no, like something bad happened, because James is like running, like he got bitten by something, or something has otherwise gone awry. And so he was panicking to come meet me at the road. And then finally I got to him and I just threw the bag in his chest, which kind of like was a bad move because we were both looking for rattlesnakes. And so he doesn't know what's in the bag. and so he was like, whoa, what's this? And then I was just like, I did it. I found one. And he was like, what are you talking about? And he opened it up, and it's just like, oh man. But yeah, this is our first alternate out there. And it was a small male. It would have been too small for transmitters, for a transmitter probably. But yeah, then I went back and showed him where I found it. And he was like, this is insane. And then he was like, oh, it's probably about to eat that dead on the road earless lizard. So we threw the earless lizard in the bucket with him and then drove him back to headquarters to process him. And on the bouncy ride there, he ate the earless lizard all by himself.
Well, that's a great story. Didn't you have one of the transmitted snakes, or maybe this was actually part of a rattlesnake publication, eat a roadkill lizard or roadkill?
Yeah, that's the one we mentioned in there. So that's the one from 2015.
Gotcha.
And then since we finished the telemetry project, another researcher did find a dead alterna in May, I believe, of 1 year that was just sitting on a hillside without a head at IMRS. And so that's kind of like the sixth documentation of alterna out there.
Yeah. Yeah, excellent. Well, great story. Amazing snake, interesting landscape. But yeah, just thank you so much for joining us today and talking about this amazing animal.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I'll be happy to come back and talk about blacktails.
For sure, we'll set it up. Great. Well, just wanted to thank the audience and tell everybody to remember snakes are animals too, and it's a privilege to see one in the wild.